I remember the first time I set eyes again on the town of Haversfield after so many years away. It didn't feel like a homecoming, more like being called into an interrogation room you'd tried to forget existed. The train windows reflected my face like a ghost over the fields racing past, and I kept thinking about the message that had brought me back. My father was dying. For weeks he had hidden his condition from everyone but the doctor, and when I finally learned the truth, it was already almost too late. I had been stationed overseas with my regiment, living a life built on schedules and precision, and suddenly all of that felt irrelevant compared to the uneven beating of my father's heart, somewhere far away. The air in Haversfield was colder than I remembered, dry with the taste of iron from the old mines that had closed decades ago. When I stepped off the platform, duffel slung over my shoulder, it was as if time itself leaned in close to remind me that I was no longer the child who had once run down these streets, chasing paper kites. The family farmhouse stood at the edge of town, crouched against the winter winds, its windows staring at me like old eyes that knew too much. Inside, the place smelled not of bread and tobacco the way it had when I was young, but of antiseptic and machines, oxygen tanks, monitors, plastic tubes. My father had been reduced to frailty, a man once capable of carrying oak beams on his shoulders, now unable to lift a cup without trembling. I slipped instinctively into routines, because the military had taught me that routines were what kept chaos from devouring you. I arranged his medicine into labeled boxes, drew charts for his meals, noted down his appointments with the precision of an operations officer. There was no audience, no applause, only the sound of my own pen against the paper and the shallow rasp of his breathing in the next room. And then there was my sister, Celeste. She breezed into town from the city like a visitor on a tour, her perfume clashing with the scent of disinfectant, her high-heeled boots leaving little divots in the mud outside. She stayed in hotels instead of the farmhouse, posted polished photos to her investors as though her presence here was a quaint detour, and treated my father's illness like an unfortunate hiccup in her otherwise glamorous schedule. Celeste had always lived, as though the world were a stage set for her dramatic entrances and exits. She was good at it, too, good enough to build a fortune flipping neglected buildings and dressing them up in new paint, selling stories of rebirth to people who wanted to believe. She dismissed our town as backward, the house as worthless, me as little more than a soldier stuck in outdated duty. Yet beneath all her bravado I sensed a fear she couldn't name, that she might be exposed as hollow if anyone ever looked too closely. At night, while my father dozed in his chair, I would sit in the kitchen with the lamp casting yellow circles on the peeling linoleum and feel the weight of both past and present pressing down. Memories of childhood dinners when he would tell us stories of resilience, of how land was more than dirt. It was the thread binding us to history. He tried to keep the peace between Celeste and me even as his voice weakened, asking us to remember we were family, not rivals. But family, I was learning, could be both sanctuary and battlefield. One evening, as the snow hissed against the windows, Celeste sauntered into the kitchen in a blazer that probably cost more than the roof, repairs the farmhouse desperately needed. She smirked at my plain t-shirt, the one with my regiment's insignia, and said, "Always the good little soldier. You do realize loyalty doesn't pay dividends." I kept chopping onions, pretending not to hear, but inside her words cut deeper than she knew. Loyalty was all I had. Loyalty to the man gasping for air in the next room. Loyalty to promises I hadn't even yet been asked to make. She laughed at me, poured sparkling water into a crystal glass she must have brought from the city, and left with a final jab. "You'll see soon enough what loyalty gets you." I didn't answer. The Marines had taught me the silence of discipline, the kind that made you endure without recognition. And yet, even in my silence, I felt something stir, a sense that beneath the peeling paint and fading photographs, our father was orchestrating something neither of us fully understood. One dawn, as we watched the sun rise together from his old armchair, he pressed my hand and whispered with all the strength he could muster, "Don't let Celeste make any big moves without speaking to Mr. Harland first." Mr. Harland was his lawyer, a man who had been with him since the days he'd first taken out loans to start the family's modest contracting firm. I nodded, not fully comprehending, but the intensity in my father's eyes told me this was no casual request. As his health declined, I often caught him gazing at the farmhouse walls, almost as if he were seeing through them to something buried deeper. And when he finally handed me a sealed brown envelope, telling me not to open it until Mr. Harland gave the word, I realized that the real inheritance wasn't going to be about land or money. It was going to be about secrets, about tests, about whether we had learned anything from the way he had lived. He passed quietly the next morning, breath thinning into silence. The world didn't stop, though mine tilted. Celeste threw herself into arranging a funeral that looked more like a society gala, complete with catered delicacies and a string quartet, the kind of event where people toasted themselves as much as the deceased. She wore sunglasses that concealed whatever emotion she might have had, shaking hands with business contacts from the city who had never so much as set foot in our town before. I stood in my dress uniform near the back, watching the woman who used to braid my hair when we were children move through the room like a politician collecting votes. People came up to me with platitudes about sacrifice and nobility, but no one asked how I was holding up. That night, alone in the farmhouse kitchen with a mountain of untouched casseroles, I texted Mr. Harland. Within minutes he replied, telling me to come to his office the next morning. For the first time since stepping off the train, I felt something shift, not relief exactly, but the sense that my father's story wasn't finished, and that mine was only beginning to unfold. The morning I stepped into Mr. Harland's office, the world outside still looked muffled with frost, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The place smelled of old paper, ink, and faintly of leather polish, and I felt like a child again sitting across from a man who had been a fixture in our lives for longer than I could remember. My sister was already there, of course, perched in the chair as though it were a throne too small for her. She was scrolling through her phone, bored, detached, while two expensive-looking lawyers flanked her like statues. Mr. Harland wasted no time. He opened a heavy envelope and with a voice steady as the courthouse clock, began to read my father's will. To Celeste, he left the company, the contracts, the machinery, the name our family had built over decades. But bound to it was a leash. 5 years during which she could not sell, merge, or strip it bare. To me, he left the farmhouse and its surrounding land, with mineral rights and all associated property. Celeste laughed aloud, a sound sharp as broken glass. So I get a crippled company, and she gets a decrepit shack. Cute, but Harland wasn't finished. He pulled out a smaller sealed envelope and slid it across the desk toward me. My name was on it in my father's handwriting. I didn't open it right then. I had learned long ago in briefing rooms that sometimes silence holds more power than words. Celeste tried to argue, tried to paint me as manipulative, but Harland stayed calm, producing psychiatric evaluations and recorded messages from my father, proving that every word of the will had been chosen with clarity and intention. When the meeting ended, Celeste stormed out, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. I lingered, feeling the envelope heavy in my hands. Harland's eyes were kind but searching. "Your father trusted you to be patient. Open it when you're ready," he said. I nodded, slipping it into my bag. That night in the farmhouse, I sat alone under the yellow kitchen light, staring at the envelope as though it might burn me. Finally, I tore it open. Inside were letters, contracts, surveys. My father had shielded the mineral rights beneath our land years ago, transferring them quietly to the farmhouse's deed when a partner's business was collapsing. What everyone thought was a decaying house and useless pasture was, in fact, sitting atop a deposit of rare earth elements. And tucked among the papers was a note in his handwriting. What looks empty isn't always worthless. The truth crashed into me like a wave. He hadn't left me a burden. He had left me leverage. The kind of leverage that could protect the family or destroy it, depending on how I wielded it. The next days blurred into a new kind of battle. I met with Harland again, reviewed offers from a mining company called Bison Minerals, and learned the options. Sell outright for a lump sum, lease for royalties, or negotiate a hybrid. My logistics-trained mind latched onto the details, escrow accounts, royalty schedules, environmental clauses, as though they were mission briefings. Every figure, every clause mattered. Celeste, meanwhile, was not slowing down. She started dropping names of investors and businessmen who, she claimed, could rescue the company from its debts. One name kept surfacing, Victor Palladino. The moment she said it, I felt a chill. I knew it from reports and whispered warnings during my deployments, contractor scandals, lawsuits, corruption. He had left a trail of ruined companies behind him, always escaping just before audits landed. The first time he appeared at the farmhouse, standing tall in his tailored coat with his smile sharpened like a blade, I felt the air shift. He praised my military service, flattered Celeste's ambition, and spoke in riddles about European consortiums ready to pay fortunes for our land. I let him talk, my recorder running quietly in the corner. His papers were vague, promises without signatures, letters of intent without names. Everything about him screamed deception. Celeste, though, was mesmerized. She saw in him a savior, someone who spoke her language of fast deals and high returns. "You don't understand the real world," she spat at me one night after storming into the kitchen with another of his draft proposals. "You think patience builds empires? It doesn't. Speed does." I said nothing at first, but inside I remembered my father's last look, the way he pressed my hand, slow her down. That's when I began documenting everything. Every call, every draft, every laugh Celeste shared with Palladino on the porch. I contacted a friend from my service, now working with federal investigators, and soon the FBI was looped in. They confirmed what I suspected. Palladino was already under scrutiny, circling families in crisis to drain them dry. All I had to do was let him play his game long enough for the evidence to solidify. The farmhouse became my command post. Papers spread across the kitchen table like a battle map, recorders hidden under lamps and shelves, notebooks filled with dates and times like mission logs. Outside, the wind rattled the barn doors, but inside, every move was calculated. Celeste thought she was outmaneuvering me, but she didn't know I was already working with the law, already setting the net. And through it all, my father's presence clung to me, not as memory alone, but as a force. His planning, his faith in patience, his belief that character was the true inheritance, all of it was guiding me now. The house, once a burden, had become a fortress, its peeling paint and old wood holding secrets worth more than any skyscraper. The question was no longer whether I could handle it. It was whether I was willing to stand firm when the storm finally broke, and when my own sister stood on the other side of the fight. The storm broke at noon on a Wednesday. The farmhouse smelled of coffee and ink. My notes spread across the table when Palladino's black SUV crunched into the gravel drive. Celeste was with him, her face pale but defiant, clutching her leather folder like it contained salvation. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his smile practiced, his voice smooth as oil. "Miss Harrow," he said, my name rolling off his tongue like a performance. "I'm here to offer you $75 million, immediate transfer. All it takes is your signature on this exclusivity agreement." I didn't touch the paper. The letters on it were hollow, a net of words without weight. "Which consortium?" I asked evenly. "Which legal entity is buying?" He chuckled softly, as if humoring a child. "High net worth Europeans. Confidential until you sign, of course." That was the moment. I slid the real contract from Bison Minerals across the table, each clause neat, each number audited. "This one has names, signatures, escrow accounts already funded. Yours has promises." For the first time, his smile cracked. His eyes flickered, sharp and dangerous. "You're making a grave mistake," he snapped. Before I could answer, the back door opened. Special Agent Cole stepped in, badge in hand, 2 deputies behind him. "Actually, Mr. Palladino," he said calmly, "the mistake was yours." The room stilled. Celeste gasped as the deputies cuffed him, reading charges of wire fraud and conspiracy. Palladino's protests were sharp, desperate, but useless. The evidence I'd been gathering for weeks had become the rope around his neck. When they let him out, his eyes locked on mine, full of venom. "You think patience wins, you'll see. Minerals will ruin you." I didn't answer. Sometimes silence cuts deepest. Celeste sank into a chair, her manicured hands trembling. He said he could save us." Her voice was small, stripped of the bravado she usually wore like armor. Harland placed a glass of water in front of her. "He was saving himself," he said gently. She looked at me, eyes wide, almost pleading. You set him up. I protected the company, I said, and I protected you from losing everything. The signing with Bison Minerals that afternoon felt less like a victory and more like the end of a siege. Clause by clause, page by page, I initialed and signed, while Dr. Chen from Bison explained each safeguard, each audit, each promise of responsible extraction. The escrow transfer posted before sundown, 40 million secure, royalties scheduled for decades to come. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was blinding. Celeste wrapped her coat tight around her, her face drained of color. I thought speed was winning, she whispered, but all it did was blind me. I touched her shoulder lightly. Speed without truth is just a sprint into a wall. Dad knew that. That's why he tied your hands and trusted me with the land. For weeks after, she walked carefully, as though learning to carry her weight again. She moved out of her city hotel into the farmhouse's empty room. The first night she cooked dinner beside me, chopping vegetables without scorn, I felt the walls of the house breathe easier. Slowly, we began to rebuild, not as rivals, but as reluctant allies finding a new rhythm. Celeste threw herself into the company with a discipline I hadn't seen before. She visited job sites in boots instead of heels, shook hands with foremen, learned employees' names. She started a veterans apprenticeship program, funded not with flashy loans but with careful planning. For the first time in her life, she seemed less interested in proving herself and more in building something that lasted. And I stayed in the farmhouse, the mineral deal secure, the land still under my watch. At night, I'd sit at the same kitchen table, the old clock ticking on the wall, sipping coffee while drafting lists of tasks, not of threats anymore, but of growth. Environmental audits, training budgets, payroll schedules. I found peace in the steady hum of work, the kind that doesn't make headlines but builds futures. Months later, a letter arrived from Harland, another sealed envelope my father had left, to be opened only once the mineral rights deal was finalized. Inside was a note in his firm handwriting. To my daughters, I left you different burdens so you would learn different strengths. One would need patience, the other leadership. Together, they make a legacy. Don't let anyone convince you shortcuts are worth more than trust. Father, I read it aloud at the kitchen table. Celeste wiped at her eyes but didn't hide it. He knew exactly what he was doing, she murmured. I nodded. He always did. That night, we walked the property together. The fields lay quiet under a thin veil of frost, survey flags dotting the horizon where Bison would soon begin work. I used to hate this land, Celeste said softly. I thought it was worthless. Now I see it's the only thing that kept us honest. I stopped, looking out over the hills where our father used to walk at dawn. It wasn't just land, I said. It was a test. And we passed. The farmhouse creaked in the wind when we returned, but inside it felt different now, not like a command post, not like a relic, but like a home again. Two sisters, scarred and stubborn, finally pulling in the same direction. A family business not saved by shortcuts, but by patience. And in that steady rhythm of honest work, I realized what my father had wanted all along. Not wealth, not power, but the quiet strength of building something that lasts.